Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Okay, well, welcome to this bonus episode of the Mockingcast, the way we like it, without RJ. And just kidding, we miss him. RJ's part of Mockingbird's has sort of been pioneering this new thing called the Iowa Preachers Project, which is training preachers from around the country and is funded by the Lilly Foundation, and they were all in Des Moines this week. So that's why we couldn't ask him to also come here, because he does have a family, and
He does.
as we hear about.
Yeah. He's an old dad, so that's hard too. We hear a lot about that. Yeah.
Old dad, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah,
2
old
kids in
dad.
college and an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you do the math.
Yeah.
But so we thought when Sarah and I were talking about what to do here, we thought we'd make it a bonus episode for the Mockingcast and just give a little bit of background about what we're trying to do, and sort of our thinking behind it, our experience of it. If that sounds self-aggrandizing, so be it. But it's sort of fun to process, and I hope you can just bear with us during that. And then maybe if there's any questions or people want to talk about stuff, whatever, we'll leave the floor open. So, does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
But before we do that, Sarah, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm glad to not be with my children.
It's a huge relief.
It's a real relief.
It's a huge
and
relief.
I don't know about you, but I always do this thing where I'm like, I'm going to get the house really clean. I'm going to get all the laundry done. And then instead you just walk away from an ongoing fire. And that's what I did. Like, it's just stuff everywhere. It's disgusting. And I was just like, oh, well, that's for Sunday, Sarah.
That's for Sunday, Sarah.
Yeah. So, yeah.
We're sometimes cruel to future selves.
Yeah. Or to our spouses. Yes. Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
Well, it is fun to be here. We've done
Yeah.
these conferences. We skipped last year, and we did a sort of a strange form of it a few years ago. But it's been a fun, random thing. People always ask us, why Tyler? And there's one reason for Tyler, and his name is Matt McGill.
Yeah.
So if you know Matt McGill, let's give him a little round of applause now. He is a very special individual, and he is a cheerleader and an organizer and basically a rock promoter, kind of in the guise of a ministry person. And so he makes it so much fun to do. So that's why we're here. So that said, what are we doing on the Mockingcast, and why? How do we put it together? That was one of the questions to begin with. Well, first of all, Mockingbird started to be a place that connects the grace of God with all aspects of everyday life. And we initially, the energy was almost all on the web. And if you look back at it, you sort of say, oh, we started in 2007. That's when blogging was happening. That's when people were reading blogs and going to websites to get their sort of information. And it soon grew into kind of a motley crew of contributors and people that, just found out about us, as happens when you talk about the grace of God. And but we noticed that around 2015, our readership just plateaued. And for a while, for me, I'm always like, oh, what are we doing wrong? How is this? How can I interpret this as a criticism?
That's like always. That's Dave's baseline.
That's my baseline.
Yeah, that's good, Dave. Yeah.
It's all about me, actually. And but it turned out people were shifting the way that they the way that they digested and took in media. And one of the ways that happened was the shift towards podcasting. Yeah. And we had someone approach us during that time to basically do all of the heavy lifting of a podcast, and that I would help host. And we interviewed people for a couple years. Sarah started becoming a regular guest on it, and then slowly it morphed into something, and then it melted down. and then it rose again. So, and I would say that when we got back up on our feet and RJ joined the crew in 2017, that's when something started to really click. I don't know. I hear podcasts where it's just two people. That can work in the right two people, I guess. I don't hear many podcasts where men and women are talking together, and I don't hear many podcasts where, especially about religious or spiritual things, and that was like an opportunity, but it was also a natural thing. We didn't consciously design it. It was like Sarah would be fun to talk to every week.
Yeah.
RJ and Sarah were good friends, and RJ and I sort of did ministry together for a long time. And he's got a great radio voice.
He does.
He does.
And the face of a Kennedy. If you haven't seen him, look him up. It's remarkable.
He's a handsome guy. We all know.
He's like a Greek god.
Yeah. Hate him.
Yeah. Can I tell the story real quick
Yes.
about? Okay, I'm going to tell a story real quick, and then you're going to keep going with your prescribed thing. RJ and I worked together at a church that did a presidential funeral, and I don't know if I should tell this. Anyway, here I am. So Melania Trump is there, and I'm of course staring at her. She's out in the congregation, and there's this point in the service, and everyone's in like, it's an Episcopal church. We're in these white robes. Everyone just looks like very official. Where the priests, for some reason, come up. There's like two priests that were chosen to come up like before everything kind of processes out and stand there. Okay. And I'm looking at Melania Trump, and I'm like, what is she looking at? And then I just follow her line, and it's our friend RJ. And I was like, red alert, RJ's wife. Like, anyway, so that's, yeah.
That's funny. That wasn't the story I thought you were going to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
Yeah.
Once it took that form, the idea was to replicate the experience of the Mockingbird website in a podcast. And to do that, we would discuss various articles. We ditched the interview thing. It was too difficult. And logistically, it was a nightmare. And we were having too much fun anyway. But so then it kind of developed into sort of, we talk about 3 to 4 articles every week, every 2 weeks. And it was kind of a trial by fire as to figure out which ones worked and which ones didn't. I'd say the way that I put it together, I'm sort of the producer, I guess, of it. And the way that I think about it is like, we want something that's just plain interesting, that may have no spiritual content whatsoever. Like, no one can write cursive anymore. Like that. Oh, that's interesting. Or school drop-offs have become insane, that kind of thing. Then try to get something that's profound and kind of cultural, but also personal. Something like this past week, it was a Zadie Smith interview. Sometimes the week before, it was about estrangement and the phenomenon of estrangement in families. So something that's a little weightier, something that's kind of heavy, and then end with something devotional. So never wanted the experience of the podcast to mimic, not a sermon necessarily, but I didn't want people to ever stop listening to the podcast and feel like they'd had marching orders, or that there wasn't any comfort, or just heavier than when they logged in.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about it. I always try to have at least one Mockingbird article on there. I try to pick from an array of voices. So it's not just a bunch of men. It's not just a bunch of women. That's harder than it sounds.
Because the women are better writers. I'm just going to do this to him the whole time.
Just do it. Just to heckle me. Yeah, there's some truth to that. But then also the articles that we pull from, do you go with the same exact venues every single time? Right. And as we know, you trust media from some places and not others. And, they just quoted the Wall Street Journal. That means they're like this kind of person. They just quoted the New York Times. That means they're this kind of person. Yeah. So always want to remain a moving target. Always want to switch it up. If I feel that we've been doing too many articles from one particular publication, I'll try to switch it.
Yeah.
And if I feel like we're doing something on a particular theme too much, I'll try to switch it. And that's probably my biggest challenge, that we don't just go over the same ground.
Yeah.
The things that we love to talk about and will talk about if given the chance. We always love to talk about loneliness.
Yeah.
We like to talk about parenting, but I know we have a lot of non-parents who listen. We like to talk about therapy.
Yeah.
And there's social media. I had one person say, "Does this become a social media podcast?" And I was like, that cut me to the core. I was like, oh no, we are never talking about social media again. Or if we talk about addiction too much. So it's just, it's that kind of attempt to keep it fresh.
Yeah.
Which, but also recognizing that we have something to say that lends itself to certain situations. It's very important to me that the podcast be a place that's not, you can reliably tune in and know that you're not going to get basically triggered politically, that it's going to be clickbait or sort of, we're not there to prop up anyone's, hatreds
Yeah.
of any kind.
Yeah.
And so like that's the easier way to get traffic, is to confirm, negativity. So that's hard. I think originally I added humor into it a lot. But I think the humor is always better when it just comes up naturally.
Mm-hmm.
I know I have some sense at this point of what RJ and Sarah like to talk about and are good at talking about. I mean, Sarah really could talk about reality TV for like a long time.
We could just do several seasons.
Yeah. But I want to do that sometimes.
Yeah.
But not all the time. RJ could talk about cars,
Yeah. And the
incessantly.
New Testament.
And the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's the other thing, actually. I always wanted to avoid churchiness.
Yeah.
Because both of you ordained and I also work in a church, the gravitational pull will be to talk inside baseball about churchiness.
Yeah.
And how you define that, it just changes. But I don't want it to be something. I hear increasingly from people who aren't churchgoers or very ambivalent about Christianity, but love what we do.
Yeah. I do too.
Yeah, and that's a real, to be a voice in that world is a nice thing for me.
It's a huge gift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about what I've said, Sarah?
I mean, yeah, we were talking about, so RJ came on. When did we start? You told me
2015.
So I had our second child in 2014, and she's 10 now. So that's kind of wild to think about how long we've been doing this in some way, shape, or form. And then I think about RJ coming in. Harvey hit in 2017. And I think about RJ coming in and Harvey hitting around then. And we were both in a church that was being impacted so much by it. And then my husband's church was being impacted so much by it. And how we just were able to kind of come into that space and fall apart together a little bit with you. And then I always think about, my parents dying. We recorded the day before they died.
Yeah.
And I said something, because my husband said, don't go back. And I haven't ever. He's like, don't ever go back and listen to that episode, because I say something to the effect of like, and then you're just splat on the road. Unfortunate. And
I didn't know you did that.
Yeah, it's kind of hilarious, but you guys don't want to laugh at it, which is fine. I get it, but that's where my humor. I'm very funny about them dying, because that's definitely a scientific proven way to deal with humor and deal with death. So I always say that because I don't want people to think I'm avoiding it. But yeah, I remember recording it and I said that, and then I guess RJ sweetly went before we put it out there, he went and recorded something about how they had died.
Yeah.
And that was such a beautiful gift to me, that it was out there. And then I took a lot of time before we came back. And when we came back, I just remember the first couple episodes, I just cried so much. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there was never a maybe you should take more of a break. This is a lot of crying, but just being with me in that space was, it was part of getting through that horrible, horrible period of time. So I was very grateful for that. And we've, there's smaller things that we don't necessarily talk about in the podcast, but that we all deal with at certain points that we talk about like when we're together. And that's, I feel really lucky. I essentially have a small group with 2 dudes, that meets like twice a month pretty regularly. And that's a gift. I mean, that is what it feels like. And that is like, there's a lot of jokes because I don't ever know what we're talking about. You do faithfully send the articles. I do not read them. I don't. It's like a mystery to me when he says what they are. And I think I never want to feel like I'm preparing for it, which probably sounds stupid, but I'd want it to feel like genuine conversation.
And it is. I think it's it works much better that way.
Yeah.
And I'm also glad sometimes when RJ is like, "Oh, I thought about this," and he does prepare a little bit more,
He does,
but not often.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like the difference between reading a sermon and actually speaking to people.
Right.
So I think that the genuineness of the friendship over the years probably is a major witness, maybe, because after your parents died, I very much said to Sarah, we can stop. We don't have to keep doing this.
Oh yeah, you did.
It was you don't have to process this publicly.
Yeah.
But we've seen as that has been a real help to people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's downsides to it as well.
Sure. Yeah.
But
yeah.
the premise of the podcast is the same as Mockingbird in that we sort of see grace is the gospel is true in all times at all places.
100%.
So it's like there's nothing that necessarily you need to be threatened by.
Right.
Or it should allow for some curiosity and some imagination.
Right.
So
and
that
it
allows
should
us
allow for devastation.
allows for
right?
devastation,
Yeah.
but it gives us enormous breadth.
Yeah, it does.
In terms of what we want to talk about.
It does.
Which
yeah.
I don't take for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been really good.
I'm trying to think the other things, like when we get feedback, it is usually directed at her.
Yes.
And
it's fun to be a woman, isn't it, girls?
But that's also
I get positive stuff too.
It's
More
the
than
positive
they
stuff
do.
too,
Yeah, more than they do. Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. We get really beautiful, positive things from people. People who have found the Episcopal Church, which is always such an interesting thing because we are definitely
totally
not
disinterested in that happening.
the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
Yeah, and suddenly they've found their local Episcopal Church. A lot of people who are dealing with grief or dealing with addiction will reach out, and that's super powerful. I just had this wonderful testimony from this guy who grew up Jewish this past week. And then the negative stuff is usually just like, it truly is just, I think, me being female and being loud and funny and using cuss words. One time I got an email that said I sounded like a rapper, and I was like, thank you so much. Thank you. And I just don't respond to those. That's kind of my, that's my way. Because I feel like whenever any of us write anything like that, we are like our worst selves. Mm-hmm. And it's something we would never say to the person that we're writing it to or towards. And so I don't, for their sake, I'm not going to respond. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just feels cruel to then engage that childhood wound that is undealt with. So,
if we were going to do this, I had to know we weren't out there to prop up,
right,
or to take advantage of those hot button defenses or whatever you have,
right?
Because it's the primary liability for me of being an online person all these years is that you just traffic just comes almost in proportion to anger. And how do you do that? I mean, I remember in the early days of Mockingbird, we would approach church like mission boards and say, you should fund us. The internet's a mission field, and no one got it. Like they laughed at us, or they were polite, but I really think that's where people live.
Yeah.
And you can either completely cede the territory or just say, oh, all of this is going to be toxic, or you can try to playfully experiment with what it might look like to do something redemptive or in that direction. And I think that that's kind of what's happened at our best. So yeah, that's sort of how I view the Mockingcast. We didn't when COVID hit, we started doing it every week.
Yeah.
And that's when our statistics like tripled.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that's what I hear. Anyway, that's the thinking behind it. That's the thinking really behind Mockingbird too. Is that you can there's nothing to be threatened by out there.
Yes.
But there's ways to approach even difficult subjects. We talk about looking for grace and its absence, and we do the absence part. But
Yeah.
I think our best episodes are usually when there's some kind of we land in some way on some concrete example or story of grace. Sometimes that's something we've read. I try to make sure there's at least something that could lead to that, but a lot of times it's the stuff we've experienced.
Is there, so I have a question. Is there, because I have one. Is there like one of the stories we've talked about that like you think of a lot? Do you want to hear mine?
Yes.
While you're thinking? I'm thinking of the women. Oh gosh, were they Sudanese? They were from Africa and they had been through all these horrible atrocities and they had a Bible study.
Yeah,
remember us talking about that?
Rwanda.
Yes.
Yeah. The forgiveness.
Yes.
Her husband and 5 of her 7 children were killed, and she was we called it the greatest Bible study of all time, that episode.
Yeah, I think about those women all the time. And I said it in the podcast, but I always think like just to stand in the hallway. Like I think about those women all the time.
Yeah.
Like how after having lost everything that would make them feel like they had an identity and purpose in the world, they still managed to gather and have this identity in Jesus. Like it's just like crazy. Like it feels like how lucky are we even know that, you know, and get to talk about it. So
yeah, that was incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's one called God is on the Bathroom Floor that I think about sometimes.
Uh-huh.
But in fact, Andy Squires, who's at this conference,
Yeah.
he was friends with the woman who wrote that. She was dying of terminal cancer and talked about it was really a theology of the cross kind of story, but it was from a woman who wasn't talking. You know,
Yeah.
it was her life. I think about that one. The one that's called What If You Were Wrong About Everything?
Oh yeah.
That's the one that was right after your parents died.
Yeah.
And I think about that one sometimes, just that phrase. I actually don't think about the tragedy aspect of it, but
Yeah.
that Havrilesky quote.
Yeah. That's so
I
good.
don't know. There's a ton of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I just wondered.
We found that the longer we went, the more it was downloaded.
Wow.
And
didn't know that.
you can't ask, I mean, RJ especially is a rector of a sort of a big thriving church. You can't ask to record more like for longer than 2-hour chunks.
I have Pilates, so
Yeah, she's got Pilates. RJ has to raise money or something. Or something. So, and there was also someone asked why can't we do it every week? And I found when we were doing it every week, we did it during COVID. We stopped because we were repeating ourselves too much, and you have to have enough life each time to
Totally.
have something new to talk about.
Yeah.
As well as let the culture evolve.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's working, and we'll continue it as long as it's fun.
Mm-hmm.
But any questions or thoughts about what we said? Doesn't even have to be about the podcast.
How'd you get the name Mockingbird?
Oh, that's a good question.
How did we get the name Mockingbird? This is so many people don't know the answer to this because we never say. It is in some of our literature. One of the other chief guiding principles behind the Mockingbird Project, our organization, is that no one ever moves past their need to hear the message of God's grace and forgiveness. And so the task of the preacher or the person in ministry or is to repeat the message of the gospel over and over like a mockingbird. You don't do it, you try not to do it in repetitive ways or irritating ways. But if you're in touch with yourself and the world around you, it's I think Todd was telling me the other day, it's like you preach the gospel anew or afresh every week.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean you say the same words. It means we change as the sort of the hub of the wheel remains the same. And so that's a really important. So like a mockingbird, we're hoping that the people get a little tired of us talking about grace and forgiveness being the kind of core of the heart of God in the world. And a lot of Christians don't believe that. They think we move past that, or there's a time and a place for that, but dot 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 dot.
Yeah.
And I can see where that's coming from, and I don't want to like dismiss entire traditions. I would just say for me personally, as a neurotic, dude, I don't get sick of it.
Right.
I don't feel like I've gotten to the point where I need Jesus any less.
Right.
Or that I've somehow need to put the world at my feet.
Right. Yeah. Well, I wanted you to tell them about Lamp.
Yeah, when we were trying to figure it out, it was 2007 is when we were trying to name Mockingbird. And I was trying to avoid a really churchy name like, I don't know, St. Mary of the Highways or something like that. That's more than my mainline Protestant background. All of those names are kind of dime a dozen, and they're great. But during 2007, 2008, there was also an enormous movement among kind of non-denominational churches where everything was like the journey, the river, flowing. There was a church where I was called Clear Waters, and I wanted to avoid that.
In Manhattan was called Clear
It
Waters.
was?
What I'm just wondering. I mean, like,
No, the journey was in Manhattan.
Okay.
The story,
Yeah. I was like, Manhattan should be like the concrete, the buildings,
the concrete.
Yeah.
So how do you do something that's not hackneyed in this way or hackneyed in that way? I love the Beach Boys, and there's Brian Wilson has a song called "Love and Mercy." Love and mercy is what you need tonight, and it's a real like a mantra for me. And so Love and Mercy Project Lamp was going to be one of the
Lamp.
Could have been Lamp.
Yeah.
But for someone of my generation, that has Anchorman connotations that you can't get away from. I love Lamp. Steve Carell saying that. So I'm glad we didn't do it. And I'm glad we did it. We did a name where people don't know quite what it means.
Yeah.
I wanted it to be an invitation, I guess.
Yeah.
And plus, birds make for good imagery.
Yes.
If you're a graphic person,
Put a bird on it.
put a bird on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions?
I had a mix of 5 or 6 believers, non-believers asked me like, oh, "Hey, why are you back in Tyler?" That's my hometown. And I said something to them like, "Well, I'm going to a Mockingbird conference." Like, "Oh, what's that? What's that podcast about?" I said, "Well, it's about how grace does and doesn't appear in popular culture." And they all got like this same similar, like, "What?" And there's no idea what that means. I would elaborate, you give some personal testimonies, and it's like, there was no, he was like, "I still don't know what you mean." And it hurt.
It hurt?
It hurt because I'm here for a variety of reasons, but just like reading more, very recently, like Luther's theology, like that's changed my life so much. And it's like how I want to open that door to my non-believer friends, because I get almost more pushback from my church friends.
Sure.
And how do I without churchiness like talk more about grace with my not going to church friends?
Yeah,
It's a great question.
it's a great question. That's my new book. I like to
Dave's got a book for that.
pre-order my new book.
So
I'm
tell us what you talk about.
Okay,
in your
I'm
book.
talking about
Yeah.
it now, Grace, as terms of relief.
Yeah.
That to be a person in 2024 is to live under enormous pressure. The pressure to be somebody, the pressure to keep up with somebody or to keep up, period. The pressure to have it all together, the pressure to improve, the pressure to grow, the pressure to self-actualize, the pressure to save yourself, the pressure to basically be God. And we live in a world that's the demand is just accelerating, and I mean that the demand on women, the demand on men, the demand on old people, the demand on young people, the demand on Republicans, the demand on Democrats. It is accelerating. That's what it means to be alive today. And grace is usually a euphemism for relief. Or when we experience relief in our life, it is often a form of grace. And so, who doesn't want relief? That is kind of the premise of this book, and it's then addressing like how grace addresses various pressures, and but in terms of like what is, so I would say grace is the big relief at the heart of Christianity. It's the reason people become Christians, and the only real compelling reason to remain a Christian. And so. Yeah, if someone has ever wondered, like, what is it that's actually exciting and good news about Christianity, it's something to do with grace as revealed in Jesus Christ. So that's how I talk about it. So grace is the big relief. You could talk about grace is one-way love. Grace is unmerited favor. Grace is love that seeks you out when you have nothing to give. But it's usually, if you talk to a person who's like, have you ever fallen in love? You've experienced grace. And those are the most important moments of our lives. And so anyway, that's how I'd talk about it. And in a lot of ways, the podcast is an attempt to do that over the long haul and to say, well, we talk about grace and it's just these slogans and Bible verses, but here's where the rubber is meeting the road this week. And so it's a little bit of a come and see. Just try it out. But I sometimes think that we could use like a fresh introductory episode where we just sort of spell some things out.
Sure.
What would you add to that, sir?
I know, but like both things that you're saying, both like the desire to explain it to people and the sadness when they don't get it, and it's so like. I think I talked about this on the podcast, but my daughter, I did. My daughter had this friend, so we've just moved to this new place, and my daughter wanted to play this sport that this friend is playing. So I like mentioned it to the mom. I saw the mom out. I was like, how do we get our kid into that? And she was like, well, this is how, but honestly, our daughter is so bad at it, it's embarrassing. I mean, this is a 5th grader. And she's like, my husband and I were just talking the other day, like, how poorly this reflects on our family when she gets out there to play, but we can't get her to quit. She just keeps showing up, and it's so bad. And I was like, I wanted to lay down on the sidewalk at the elementary school and just be like, come lay with me on the sidewalk, you know? Like, I was like, I feel like you're so far gone, I can't get you out of the hole that you are currently inhabiting. This is bleak. And I know this woman goes to church. I don't know what the hell they're saying in the pulpit, but I know this woman goes to church. So it's, like, I don't have magic words. I think the only thing that we can be, I mean, I make jokes about this on the podcast because, like, I am rarely ever this dressed up for anything, but, like, I think the only thing we can be is ourselves for people. And I think meeting them in a place of, like, mercy when their life goes wildly astray. And even like in our conversations about however we live our lives, like, you know, one of the hardest things for me when my parents died was, you know, I have all this incredible family that stepped in, but that, like, a lot of them don't go to church. And like, even for people who go to church, the idea of forgiveness pretty immediately when someone has caused the deaths of loved ones was really hard for them. Like, they were like, why aren't you angrier? You should be holding these people more accountable. And I think I would have if I hadn't experienced Mockingbird, frankly. Yeah. So, I don't know. Just, like, be yourself. It's, like, the worst advice. But also, like, I know the sadness of, like, being like, oh, my God, this is how you wake up in the morning? Jesus. You know? Like, so.
Time for a couple more.
I just want to tell you all that I'm never unhappy that I listen. Like, I'm always glad.
Oh,
Even
that's
if
so
I'm like,
nice.
oh yeah, I think I'll check it out or whatever. But every time I'm so glad.
Well, that's so
Every
nice.
time. And that,
Thanks.
I just wanted to tell you, Sarah, that your Lexapro advertisement
Yes.
worked on me personally.
I'm so glad. I am getting a kickback. They're a sponsor. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. That's good. Yes, I'm glad. Yes. God also made psychiatric medication per your brother, who said that on Brothers All.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
What? Any other thoughts?
Yes. How do you guys deal with the pressure, or is there pressure? Talking about relieving pressure, like you've created this thing. Is it surreal to you now that people pay money to show up and like come hear you and talk to you? And I just imagine seeing the growth over the years has been really cool for you to watch and experience. And do you show up thinking like, I'm just David, I'm just Sarah? Is it hard to sort of decide who to be when you're here? Is it hard to like interact with fans? Is it not fans? It's like it's not a good word for it, but I don't know. How do you handle that personally? Is it surreal? Is it?
I have a couple thoughts.
You go first.
I don't want to speak for Sarah, but I can almost speak for her. I think we're both married to people that don't allow us to
100%.
get too big. Like who do you think you are? The cult of personality around American Christianity is demonic. And so and we're not immune from it.
Sure.
Sarah and I aren't, like, it's a liability, and it's a spiritual blind spot. And so anything we can do to distance ourselves from that is like a good thing. You're never going to find a green room at a Mockingbird conference.
Right. Even if you really want one.
Yeah, it'd be so nice. And people, I guess, can have green rooms if they want, but I've seen it just wreak such havoc.
Yeah.
And the something about the church and celebrity, maybe it's in the modern context, it just doesn't compute with the Jesus way. And so whatever we can do to safeguard ourselves from that, without like putting your lamp under a bushel. Where's RJ?
I know. We don't know the Bible. And we just started reading it. So, yeah.
It's a real thing.
Yeah.
And so, it's very minor. This is like a very minor leagues, but
Yes.
the things you live for is when you hear from people that it's made, allowed them to hold on to their faith.
Yes.
Or brought, not for the sake of holding on to their faith, but for the sake of holding on to any kind of hope in a world of despair.
Yeah.
It's allowed them to remain dialed into, their family. I don't know what it is, but those are the things that are really great. But it is strange when you have a podcast where you're talking about your lives and people then they assume they know you like really well, and that's just going to be odd in any context, I think.
Yeah.
But anything we can do to buffer ourselves, like, my dad is involved with this ministry. My mom is, both my brothers and my sister-in-law. And there was a very conscious decision not to include Zal in the name of anything we do and to avoid feeding that if there was a cult around that. And then that's just because, and it wasn't because I didn't think people should hear more from my father or from my brother, or they need to hear more only from me. It was really because I think that the ways in which the transference has worked in my father's life has been a huge burden, and I've watched it undo so many people. That's not going to be sufficient protection, but it is something to bear in mind. And the growth hasn't actually been that dramatic. It's been arithmetic, and I've watched.
What does that mean?
Geometric growth versus arithmetic is multiplication versus addition, Sarah.
It's like, why are we in math class? Okay. Okay.
I think that's what's something that people like trust about it, perhaps. But I've watched ministries explode and then implode at the same rate, and I've been jealous. like, oh, I wish we had that amount of money,
Right,
that amount
sure.
of following, that amount of
Yeah.
influence. But in each case, it feels like God's protected us from that while continuing to allow us to have some kind of expanding, to make it worth, you're not doing it so no one hears it, like you're not writing books so no one reads them.
Yeah.
So anyway, I feel like I at times I think in my own relationship with God, I'd been frustrated. It's like, we're sacrificing so much. This is so hard. It'd be so easy to do X, Y, or Z, or to fall into this ditch or that ditch. Why won't you make it larger? And I think God has answered that prayer by allowing us to never explode. The closest thing that's come to exploding is the podcast. But we can't see that, so that helps. Like if it was Sarah, RJ, and I getting up there in front of whatever, there's 20,000 people that listen to this podcast. If we were getting up in front of a thing and talking to 20,000 people, I imagine that'd be pretty intoxicating.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I would
I don't think
handle
it would
that.
be as funny either.
It wouldn't be very funny.
Yeah.
Be super self-conscious.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sarah, what do you say about that? Because I think the identification happens a little more with you
It does.
than it happens with me, and certainly not with RJ.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's hard. I can't remember did you ask this question? Yeah, sometimes it's hard. And this is not to say you can't do this today, but like I noticed after my parents died that people would like come up to me crying and then they would say the worst thing that had ever happened to them, which I don't know if you guys know, there's a real gamut of bad things that can happen to people. And I'm like standing there and then they look at me and they say, oh my God, I'm so sorry your parents died. And then they start crying again because they feel like they know it intimately. And on some level they do because they heard me cry, right? And so that's hard. But past that, I don't really pay a lot of attention to it. Like sometimes you'll tell us the numbers. I usually just like post a meme of a drag queen and then just move on with my day. Do you know what I mean? I try not to pay too much attention to it. And if I hear language about us that's really positive, I do this disassociative thing where I'm like, Sarah Gondon sounds like she really has it together. Like I've always done that to just try to, because I don't think it helps. I also just feel like this is like a pastoral care podcast. So I feel like people feel taken care of. Like it feels like my ministry when I was a hospital chaplain. It's like you're meeting people where they are in this really vulnerable place. We're all in existential crisis. And there's like an exchange in that's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. And so I just feel like there's more people gathered around the fire. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like we're not the fire.
That's a great way of saying it. I never heard you say that. Yeah, what you said is, I think that's another core conviction, though, is that everyone's basically having an existential crisis at all times.
Yeah.
Or they're in active denial about it.
100%.
Or they're about to have one.
100%.
And so we presume a level of that.
Yeah.
And I think that exhausts some people, but for the most part, it can be an enlivening thing. Because I really don't think people, we've talked about it on the program, but I don't think what people need is challenge and exhortation and much more information. I think like some sort of acknowledgement of the pain and the difficulty of life. And in the middle of that, and if you could do that through speaking actually among friends, in the middle of that to point or to hear about the grace of God afresh can be a really sustaining thing. And that's what I actually hope's happening in the podcast.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I think we got one more comment or question.
I'm kind of wondering if you talked a little bit about this, I think, but just what the challenges of being so open about your lives and your opinions about just the articles, and like you talked about it maybe in interacting with people at conferences, but in your day-to-day life or in other ways, just like the level of openness you guys have.
I'm just hitting a point now where like my daughter came home and told me all her teachers listen.
Oh.
And that's like, come on now. Nashville is like the heart of Jesus, right? And so it's not so we kind of live in the epicenter, and that made me a little bit more like, But I remember when we found out that my husband had a brother that we didn't know when we first heard from John.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being here in one of these chairs and like referencing it for the first time. And like, there's also something really freeing about not hiding stuff. I think everybody hides way too much. I think families hide way too much. If you're sitting in this room and you fathered a child, because it would be the dad, you fathered a child in college, 23andMe is coming for your ass. Okay? We're going to find out. So,
I think they got in trouble last week.
they've gotten in trouble. I just think I kind of don't have a lot of patience for it. It is harder on my husband, who is more private. But I would say like over the years, he's gotten more used to it. And sometimes things will happen and he'll say, please don't talk about this on the podcast. And I used to be like, okay, that's funny. I'm going to talk about whatever I want to talk about. I have a little bit more respect for that now. Yeah, I mean, it's because like people at his church listen to it. And so like, what is that going to look like? And how are they going to feel? And, but we're all I always push back so much against that tendency to cover because everyone is in existential crisis. And if we act otherwise as Christians, that's actually living in sin. So, yeah.
That's well put.
I mean,
yeah, I find it to be, I don't disclose as much. But I don't.
which is very male also.
Yeah.
Let's just say, like, that is pretty male.
RJ's
yeah.
pretty girly, let's face it. Like,
That's
he's just,
true. With his,
I mean,
like,
I give him a hard
Disney
time. He's one of
songs.
my,
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
in my
yeah.
wedding
Yeah, they're
for crying
close.
out loud.
Yeah.
But that's good. I think actually I hear from men that don't expect guys to be as vulnerable. It just
Yeah.
comes naturally to us because we're
Yeah.
both that way, I think.
Yeah.
And my father was that way.
Totally.
So I've gotten into trouble before.
Yeah.
You have to be free to for the creativity to actually work and the show to be authentic. You have to not be thinking about the critics or the critical voices in your head. It's just like writing. But that also means that you have to be attentive to being able to edit where things go off the rails. And by and large, I feel like we do a pretty good job of that. But it's a really good question. And it is sometimes funny because you find out who's listening in your immediate
Yes.
surrounding.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Yeah.
what? You
Yeah.
know, I thought, it would only be people that come to our church or something in
Yeah.
Virginia. It's not true.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah, that's it. I think we're out of time. It is 5:00. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you for listening to the podcast. It's
Yeah,
only... It's really nice to see that it
Yeah.
connects with people.
Yeah.
And it's fun for me and Sarah to get to be together
Yeah,
in
it
person
is
and talk
fun.
about it.
It is fun. Yeah. Thanks,
right.
y'all.
Onward and upward.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.